The air in my parents' dining room was thick with the scent of pot roast and 30 years of unspoken resentment. It was their 40th wedding anniversary, and the old oak table was crowded with relatives who all seemed to be looking anywhere but at me. My girlfriend, Clara, squeezed my hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement of the tension I'd warned her about. My mother, Carol, raised her glass, her eyes shining as they landed on my younger brother, Ethan. He was leaning back in his chair wearing a designer shirt that probably cost more than my first car, soaking in the adoration. "I just want to thank my beautiful son, Ethan," my mother announced, her voice brimming with pride. "He takes such good care of us. I don't know what we'd do without him." Her gaze then drifted over to me, and the warmth in her eyes instantly chilled. "You should learn from your brother, Leo. He's the one holding this family together." That was it. That was the line. Years of being the second choice, the reliable backup, the quiet son whose achievements were measured against the bright, burning flame of my brother. It all came to a head in that single, dismissive sentence. I felt something inside me finally snap. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. My voice was steady, dangerously calm. "If that's the case, then from now on you can ask Ethan to pay for all of it. I'm not sending another dollar." The chatter stopped. The clinking of forks on plates ceased. My father, Mark, looked up from his plate, his face a mask of confusion. My mother stared at me, her brow furrowed in genuine disbelief. "What money?" she asked, her tone sharp and accusing. "We've never seen a dime from you, Leo." The lie was so blatant, so absolute, it sucked the air right out of my lungs. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cold, hard rectangle of my phone. The truth was about to detonate in the middle of this picture-perfect family dinner, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. My name is Leo Maxwell, and for most of my life I lived in the shadow of a lie built by the very people who were supposed to love me most. To understand how we got to that disastrous anniversary dinner, you have to understand the house I grew up in. It was a small two-story colonial in a suburb west of Cleveland, a place where the lawns were neatly cut and the ghosts of the steel industry still lingered in the air. My father, Mark, had worked at the mill for 40 years, just like his father before him. He was a man of quiet routine and immense pride in his work. He valued substance over style, or so I thought. My mother, Carol, managed our home with a similar no-nonsense efficiency. In our world, you were supposed to be judged by the sweat on your brow and the honesty of your labor. But inside the four walls of our house, a different set of rules applied. In our house, my father's principles seemed to bend and break around my younger brother, Ethan. That shadow I lived in, it had a name, and that name was Ethan. Ethan was born with a spotlight attached to him. He was loud, charming, and effortlessly funny. He could walk into a room of stony-faced adults and have them laughing in minutes. He learned early on that a bright smile and a well-told story were worth more than good grades or a clean room. He wasn't a bad kid, not really, but he was a performer. Life was his stage, and we were all his audience. I, on the other hand, was the quiet observer in the wings. I was the kid who was more interested in taking apart our broken toaster to see how the coils worked than I was in being the center of attention. I found comfort in the predictable logic of numbers and the quiet solitude of my room, where I'd build intricate Lego structures for hours. To my parents, my interests were strange, my quietness a defect. "Why can't you be more outgoing, like your brother?" was the constant, weary refrain of my childhood. The difference in how we were treated was never clearer than the spring I turned 14. I had always excelled at math, and after months of studying and competing, I made it to the state mathletes championship in Columbus. It was a huge deal for me, a validation of the one thing I felt truly good at. The competition was grueling, a full day of complex problems and intense pressure. But I won. I came in first place in my division. I remember the bus ride home, clutching the heavy gold-painted trophy, feeling a sense of pride that was so new and overwhelming it almost made me dizzy. I imagined my parents' reaction, picturing the surprise and maybe, just maybe, the same kind of pride they showed Ethan for far less. I walked into the house, holding the trophy like an offering. My mom was in the kitchen, and my dad was watching the news. "I won," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My mom glanced over from the sink. "Oh, that's nice, honey. Put it on the shelf in your room." My dad just grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes still glued to the television. There was no celebration, no flood of questions, no phone calls to relatives. It was just an event that happened. The trophy, a symbol of the biggest achievement of my young life, was relegated to a dusty corner of my bedroom next to a stack of old science books. 2 weeks later, Ethan was in the school play. He was cast as third villager from the left and had exactly one line: "Hark, who goes there?" For the entire month leading up to the play, it was the only thing my parents talked about. They bought a new camcorder to capture the moment. They invited my aunts, uncles, and our next-door neighbors. My mom spent a whole afternoon helping Ethan practice his single line, coaching him on inflection and projection as if he were preparing for Broadway. On the night of the play, they sat in the front row of the school auditorium, beaming. When Ethan delivered his line a bit too loudly and a second too late, my dad clapped so hard his hands turned red. Afterward, it was a full-blown celebration. We went out for ice cream, and my parents recounted the glory of Ethan's performance to the entire restaurant. They praised his stage presence, his confidence, his natural star quality. A blurry, out-of-focus photo of Ethan on stage, dressed in a burlap tunic, was printed, framed, and given a place of honor on the living room mantelpiece. I sat there, quietly eating my vanilla sundae, looking from the framed photo of the third villager to the invisible space where my state championship trophy should have been. It was then that I learned the core lesson of my family. It didn't matter what you actually did. All that mattered was how well you sold the story. My quiet, tangible success was invisible. Ethan's loud, mediocre performance was legendary. That night, I didn't just feel second best. I felt like I was speaking a language my own family refused to understand. That lesson that the story was all that mattered became the invisible wall between me and my family. As I moved through high school, I saw how thoroughly Ethan had mastered the art of performance. He coasted on charm, talking his way into passing grades and convincing my parents that every lazy shortcut he took was a sign of cleverness. I, on the other hand, doubled down on the only thing I could control: my work. I buried myself in my studies, finding a sense of fairness in the definitive right or wrong answers of math and science. While Ethan was out being the life of the party, I was in my room teaching myself how to code, building a future brick by logical brick. I knew I had to get out. Not just out of our small house, but out of the gravitational pull of their expectations. My acceptance into a university in Colorado, with a partial scholarship for their data science program, felt less like an achievement and more like an escape plan. College was for me a crucible. I was determined to graduate without being a financial burden, which meant a grueling schedule of classes, study sessions, and soul-crushing part-time jobs. My life became a cycle of fluorescent-lit libraries that smelled like old paper and dust, and the greasy air of the campus diner where I washed dishes until 2 in the morning. I lived on instant ramen and cheap coffee, my main source of comfort being the elegant certainty of a perfectly executed line of code. Every student loan I signed was a promise to myself. I was building something real, something tangible that no one could dismiss or ignore. My degree wouldn't be a story, it would be a fact, earned through sleep deprivation and relentless effort. Meanwhile, Ethan's journey after high school was a masterclass in failing upward. He enrolled in a local community college, declared it was stifling his creativity, and dropped out after a single semester. But in the eyes of our parents, this wasn't failure, it was the bold first step of a visionary. He announced he was going to be an entrepreneur, and my parents, who barely understood what the word meant, ate it up. His ventures were a series of short-lived, spectacular flameouts. First, he was going to revolutionize the coffee industry by drop-shipping mugs with ironic sayings on them. That lasted until he realized it involved logistics and customer service. Then, he was a day trader, a passion that evaporated the moment his initial $100 investment from my dad vanished. Each failure was expertly reframed for my parents as a crucial learning experience. The lost money wasn't a loss, it was seed capital for his business education. His lack of a job wasn't unemployment, it was keeping his schedule open for the next big opportunity. I'd call home, exhausted after a 16-hour day of classes and work, and my mom would barely ask about my midterms before launching into a breathless monologue about Ethan's latest brilliant idea. He's thinking of starting a podcast, Leo. He just needs a bit of money for some top-of-the-line microphones. Your father and I think it's a wonderful idea. He has such a great voice for radio, you know. I remember one call in particular, during my junior year. I was running on 3 hours of sleep, stressed about a major project, and my rent check was due. I cautiously asked if they could spare even $100 to help me get through the week. My mom's voice tightened with a familiar sigh. "Oh, Leo, Things are so tight right now. You know how at Island. An hour later, I saw a post on Ethan's social media. It was a picture of him and his friends at a concert in Chicago with a caption that read, "Big things coming, networking with the movers and shakers. Number entrepreneur life." My mom had shared the post, adding a comment, "So proud of our go-getter." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. They couldn't help me with groceries, but they could fund his networking trip. When I finally graduated, holding a degree that had cost me 4 years of my youth, I felt a profound sense of weary triumph. I accepted the job offer in Denver without hesitation. It wasn't just a career, it was 1,000 miles of distance. It was a chance to finally build a life where my worth was measured by my own achievements, not judged in the reflection of my brother's dazzling, empty performances. I was free, or so I believed. I had no idea that the shadow I'd spent my whole life trying to outrun was about to stretch all the way to the Rocky Mountains. My first couple of years in Denver were the quietest, most peaceful years of my life. I had a good job as a data scientist at a growing tech firm, a small but comfortable apartment with a view of the distant mountains, and a routine that was blessedly, beautifully predictable. My life was a spreadsheet, and I loved it. Every expense was tracked, every goal was quantified. For the first time, I felt like I was in complete control of my own narrative. The calls home became less frequent, settling into a comfortable rhythm of bi-weekly check-ins. They were surface-level conversations, mostly about the weather in Ohio or a project I was working on, described in the simplest terms I could manage. I kept the details of my life to myself, a carefully guarded sanctuary. I was polite, I was distant, and I was finally content. That carefully constructed peace shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. My phone rang, and I saw my mom's picture pop up. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Leo?" Her voice was thin and frayed with a panic I hadn't heard since I was a child and Ethan had fallen out of a tree. "It's your father. The doctors are saying he has to stop working. Immediately." I felt my stomach clench. My dad, who had never missed a day of work in his life, was being forced into retirement. Years of breathing in the dust and chemicals at the steel mill had finally caught up with his lungs. The official diagnosis was pulmonary fibrosis, a cruel, unforgiving disease that was slowly turning his lungs to scar tissue. After the initial shock, the practical realities came crashing down. My mom, her voice trembling, laid it all out. His pension was a fraction of what they had been counting on. Her part-time job as a receptionist barely covered the groceries, and the medical bills for inhalers, oxygen tanks, and specialists were already piling up on the kitchen table. "We're going to lose the house, Leo," she whispered. And in that moment, all the distance I had built melted away. It was still my home. They were still my parents. As she spoke, a hot flash of anger surged through me. Where was Ethan in all of this? Where was the golden child, the go-getter who was always just one big deal away from striking it rich? He lived 15 minutes away from them. Why was I the one getting this desperate phone call 1,000 miles away? I knew why. Because when a real crisis hit, the stories and the charm were worthless. All that mattered was the cold, hard reality of a bank account balance. I muted the phone, took a deep breath, and opened the spreadsheet that ran my life. I looked at my salary, my rent, my student loan payments. I started cutting things: my vacation fund, my budget for eating out, the new car I'd been saving for. I ran the numbers a dozen times, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I could do it. It would be tight. It would mean sacrificing the comfortable life I'd just started to build, but I could keep them afloat. I unmuted the phone. "Mom, it's okay," I said, my voice much calmer than I felt. "I'm going to send you money every month. $3,000. It should be enough to cover the mortgage and the bills." A wave of choked, grateful sobs came through the phone, but then came the logistical hurdle. "Oh, Leo, I don't know anything about those banking apps," she said, her voice laced with anxiety. "Your father and we just use cash and checks. It's all so complicated." I sighed. I knew this would be an issue. I tried to explain how simple a direct transfer was, but I could hear the rising panic in her voice. Then she said the words that would change everything. "Couldn't you just send it to Ethan? He's right here. He could just get the cash from the bank for us. It would be so much easier." My entire body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at me to say no. But what was the alternative? Arguing with my distraught mother? Forcing them to learn a system they were terrified of? It felt cruel. And maybe a small naive part of me thought this was a chance for Ethan to finally do something responsible. I called him later that day. His voice was dripping with false sincerity and bravado. "Don't you worry about a thing, big bro," he said, his tone impossibly cheerful. "You just send the money to me. I'll make sure mom and dad are taken care of. You can count on me." I didn't feel reassured. I felt a deep, chilling sense of dread. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that not even Ethan could betray a trust like this. That night, I logged into my bank account, set up the recurring transfer, and sent the first $3,000 into the shadow I thought I had escaped. The first transfer went through, and I felt a strange mix of relief and resentment. The relief came from knowing that, for now, my parents were safe. The mortgage would be paid, the lights would stay on. But the resentment simmered just below the surface, a low-grade fever that colored my days. My life in Denver, once a symbol of my independence, was now governed by a sacrifice no one knew I was making. The spreadsheet that once mapped my future, a down payment on a condo, a trip to see the national parks, was now a ledger of austerity. I started brown bagging my lunch every day, turning down after-work drinks with colleagues, and spending my weekends hiking on free trails instead of exploring the city's restaurants. My world became smaller, quieter. I told myself it was noble, a son's duty. I told myself it was temporary. Back in Ohio, a very different story was unfolding on my phone screen. About 2 months after the payment started, a new post appeared on Ethan's Instagram feed. It was a picture of him, grinning from ear to ear, leaning against the hood of a brand new metallic gray BMW. The caption was a masterclass in vague, obnoxious hustle culture speak. Decided it was time for an upgrade. When you bet on yourself, it always pays off. Hard work speaks for itself. Number entrepreneur, number hustle, number blessed. My heart hammered against my ribs. A car like that costs at least $700 a month to lease, maybe more. Where was that money coming from? I quickly did the math in my head, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe he'd finally landed a real client. Maybe one of his dozen failed ventures had finally sprung to life. It had to be a coincidence. It couldn't be my money. But then the posts kept coming. There were pictures of expensive steak dinners captioned, "Wining and dining new clients." There was a wrist shot of a sleek, expensive-looking watch with the hashtag "number time to level up." There were endless stories of him at trendy rooftop bars, raising a glass of craft bourbon to the camera. His online persona was meticulously curated to scream success, and with every post, the knot of dread in my stomach tightened. I tried to rationalize it. This was just Ethan being Ethan. He was probably putting it all on a credit card, trying to project an image of success to attract actual success. He wouldn't be so foolish, so cruel, as to steal from his own family. When I'd call my mom, I'd cautiously ask how things were. "Oh, everything is fine, dear," she'd say. "Ethan has been such a help. He stops by every week to give us the cash. He's such a good boy." Her reassurances were a temporary balm on a festering wound. I chose to believe her because the alternative was too monstrous to consider. My life became a strange double existence. By day, I was the diligent, quiet data scientist, finding solace in the clean logic of my work. By night, I was a secret benefactor, scrolling through my brother's fictional life with a growing sense of sickness. The isolation was beginning to wear me down. It was on a particularly gray afternoon, while trying to escape my own thoughts at a coffee shop near my office, that I met Clara. She was sitting at a nearby table, sketching in a notebook, and I noticed she was struggling to keep a massive roll of architectural blueprints from falling onto the floor. I got up and helped her secure them, and she flashed me a smile that was so genuine and warm it felt like the first ray of sun after a long winter. She told me she was an architect, and we fell into an easy conversation about our jobs, her world of tangible structures, and my world of invisible data. There was an immediate connection, a shared appreciation for things that were real and well-made. She was sharp, funny, and had a way of looking at me that made me feel like she was seeing past the quiet, stressed-out exterior to the person underneath. Our first coffee date turned into a second, which turned into dinner the following week. With Clara, I felt a sense of normalcy I hadn't realized I was craving. She was the antithesis of my family's drama. She was grounded, honest, and what you see is what you get. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of real happiness. She made me forget, for a few hours at a time, the financial burden I was carrying and the gilded lie my brother was living. But I knew I couldn't keep my two worlds separate forever. Sooner or later, The carefully constructed walls I had built around my family's secret were bound to come crashing down. Our relationship grew deeper through the fall and into the winter. Clara's presence in my life was like a load-bearing wall I never knew I needed. She was logical, kind, and had zero tolerance for nonsense. We spent quiet evenings at my apartment, cooking dinner together, the easy silence between us a comfort I'd rarely known. It was on one of those nights, as we were cleaning up after a simple meal of pasta and wine, that she finally called me out. I was staring at my phone, a fresh wave of nausea washing over me as I looked at a picture Ethan had just posted. Him and a group of friends on a ski trip in Vail, all of them holding up expensive cocktails against a backdrop of snow-covered mountains. The caption was a simple, infuriating, "Work hard, play harder." Clara came up behind me and gently took the phone from my hand. "You do that a lot," she said, her voice soft but direct. "You get this look on your face whenever you see something from back home. It's like you're watching a car wreck in slow motion. What is really going on, Leo?" I looked at her clear, concerned eyes, and the dam I had so carefully constructed inside me finally broke. I told her everything. I started with my childhood, with the mathlete's trophy and the school play, trying to explain the deep, foundational unfairness of it all. I told her about my dad's illness, about my mom's panicked phone call, and the crushing weight of responsibility that had fallen on my shoulders. And then, hesitantly, I told her about the arrangement. I explained how I sent $3,000 every month, and how, for the sake of convenience, it all went through Ethan. As I said the words out loud, for the first time, I heard how utterly naive it sounded. I tried to frame it as a practical solution, a simple matter of logistics. "My parents just aren't good with technology," I said, the excuse sounding weak even to my own ears. "It was just easier this way." Clara listened to the entire story without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, a heavy silence hung in the air between us. She finally spoke, her voice measured and calm, the way an architect reviews a blueprint for a fatal flaw. "So, let me get this straight," she began, her gaze unwavering. "You work 60 hours a week. You've put your own life on hold to support your parents. And you send a significant amount of money every month to your younger brother, the one you've just described as a charming but irresponsible performer, and you just trust that he's delivering all of it?" The way she laid it out, so clinically, stripped away all of my justifications. She then picked up my phone, navigated to Ethan's profile, and held it up. "Leo, I'm an architect. I build things for a living. I know what things cost. That watch he wears, that's $5,000 minimum. The lease on that BMW is $1,000 a month, easy. People don't fund this kind of lifestyle with good ideas. They fund it with cash. Are you absolutely certain it isn't your cash?" A defensive anger flared up inside me. It was irrational, but it was powerful. "You don't know him," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You don't know my family. It's complicated." It was a weak defense, and we both knew it. I was defending the very dynamic that had suffocated me my entire life. I think I was ashamed that my family was this broken, and even more ashamed that I might be this gullible. Admitting she was right would mean admitting that my sacrifice had been a joke, that I was being played for a fool by the one person I should have trusted the least. Clara saw the wall go up and she wisely backed down, but she didn't retract her statement. She took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Listen to me," she said gently. "I'm not trying to attack your brother. I'm on your team. I see how hard you work, and I hate the idea of anyone taking advantage of that. That's all." She let go, leaving me standing in the middle of my kitchen, the silence buzzing with unspoken truths. "Just promise me you'll think about it," she added before changing the subject. But it was too late. She had planted a seed of doubt that was impossible to ignore. For months, I had been looking at the facts, but my deep-seated, desperate need to believe in my family had stopped me from connecting them. Now, thanks to Clara's clear-eyed logic, the pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of betrayal that was horrifying and I was beginning to fear undeniable. Clara's words echoed in my mind for weeks. Her simple, direct logic had dismantled my carefully constructed denial, leaving me with a cold, gnawing suspicion that I couldn't shake. Every time I saw a new post from Ethan, a fancy dinner, a weekend getaway, it felt like a personal insult. Every dollar I saved by eating instant noodles felt like it was being converted into a sip of his overpriced bourbon. The seed of doubt had sprouted into a thorny vine, wrapping itself around my thoughts. "So, When my mother called to announce they were planning a small dinner for their 40th wedding anniversary and that my attendance was non-negotiable, I felt a surge of both dread and grim resolve. This wasn't just a family obligation anymore. It was a fact-finding mission. Clara, sensing my internal conflict, immediately insisted on coming with me. "We're a team," she said, leaving no room for argument. "I'm not letting you walk into the lion's den alone." The flight from Denver to Cleveland felt like a descent. With every mile we traveled east, the clear, sharp air of the Rockies seemed to be replaced by the heavy, humid atmosphere of my past. I spent most of the flight staring out the window, replaying conversations in my head, scrutinizing every one of my mother's vague reassurances. I was no longer the son returning home out of a sense of duty. I was an auditor, flying in to examine a set of books I now suspected were fraudulent. Clara sat beside me, a calming presence in the midst of my internal storm. She didn't press me to talk, but every so often she'd rest her hand on mine, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this anymore. The moment we stepped through the front door of my childhood home, the old dynamic snapped back into place like a magnet. My mother gave me a quick, distracted hug before turning to Clara, her smile polite but failing to reach her eyes. She gave Clara the brief, once-over appraisal reserved for threatening outsiders. My dad, looking frailer than ever in his armchair, offered a weak wave. The welcome was lukewarm, obligatory. An hour later, a car horn blared from the driveway, and the entire energy of the house shifted. Ethan burst through the door, a whirlwind of manufactured charisma. "Happy anniversary, you two," he boomed, presenting my mother with a bouquet of carnations that was more cellophane than flower. Instantly, my parents lit up. My mom cooed over the flowers, and my dad's face broke into a proud smile. "Is that the new car, son?" he asked, craning his neck to see the gleaming BMW in the driveway. "She's a real beauty." Ethan launched into a story about how he'd negotiated a killer deal, a tale full of business jargon that was clearly meant to impress. My parents hung on his every word, their faces glowing with admiration. Clara and I might as well have been pieces of furniture. I watched the scene unfold, a silent observer in my own home. I kept catching Clara's eye. She had a carefully neutral expression, but I could see the understanding in her gaze. She was seeing it all now, firsthand the blatant favoritism, the worship of style over substance. Her presence was like a mirror, reflecting the sheer absurdity of the situation back at me. The hours leading up to dinner were a masterclass in quiet humiliation. Every attempt I made to engage my parents in a real conversation was deflected. I started to tell them about a major project I was leading at work, only for my mom to interrupt with, "Ethan, honey, tell Uncle Frank that funny story about your meeting last week." They didn't want to hear about my stable, successful life in Denver. They wanted the entertainment of Ethan's fabricated adventures. He was the family's main event, and I was just the opening act nobody paid to see. The final straw came just as my mom was calling everyone to the table. My dad struggled to his feet, leaning on Ethan's arm for support. He patted my brother's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank God one of my boys learned how to make some real money," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I don't know where your mother and I would be without you, son." He said it right in front of me, without a flicker of shame or self-awareness. That was it. The last thread of my composure snapped. As we all sat down at that old oak table, the scent of pot roast filling the air, I knew the quiet was over. A storm was coming, and I was finally ready to be the lightning. Sitting at that dinner table felt like being submerged in water. The sounds of my relatives' cheerful chatter were muffled and distant, distorted by the roaring in my own ears. I watched my family perform the familiar play they had rehearsed my entire life. Ethan was the charismatic star, regaling everyone with exaggerated stories of his business meetings and potential investors. My parents were the fawning directors, hanging on his every word and lobbing him easy questions to keep the spotlight firmly on him. I was a ghost at the feast, a silent spectator whose presence was barely registered. I pushed a piece of dry pot roast around my plate with my fork, the food tasteless in my mouth. Beside me, Clara was a statue of coiled tension, her polite smile a thin veneer over her own simmering anger on my behalf. Her hand found mine under the table, and her grip was the only thing that felt real. The moment came, as I knew it would, during the toast. My mother, her face flushed with wine and pride, tapped her glass with a fork. The room fell into an expectant hush. She beamed, raising her glass, not to her husband of 40 years, but to her youngest son. "I just want to take a moment," she began, her voice thick with emotion, to thank my beautiful son Ethan. In these last couple of years, with your father's health, well, he has been our rock. He takes such good care of us. I honestly don't know what we would do without him." A smattering of supportive murmurs went around the table. My Aunt Linda wiped a tear from her eye. Ethan soaked it all in, giving a humble, magnanimous nod as if he were accepting an Oscar. Then, my mother's gaze swung around to me. The warmth vanished, replaced by the familiar look of maternal disappointment. It was a look that said, "Why can't you be more like him?" "You should learn from your brother, Leo," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "He's the one holding this family together." That was it. The public humiliation, the casual erasure of my sacrifice, the sheer injustice of it all, it coalesced into a single point of cold, crystalline rage. The years of resentment didn't erupt out of me in a shout. They solidified into a calm that was far more dangerous. I felt Clara squeeze my hand, a silent plea to let it go. But I couldn't, not anymore. I gently pulled my hand from hers and slowly, deliberately, pushed my chair back. The harsh scrape of wood on linoleum cut through the reverent atmosphere. Every eye in the room swiveled to me. I stood up, my heart hammering not with fear, but with a strange, liberating certainty. I looked directly at my mother, my voice even, and devoid of emotion. "If that's the case," I said clearly and concisely, "then from now on you can ask Ethan to pay for all of it. I'm not sending another dollar." The shock in the room was a physical thing. You could feel the air crystallize. My Aunt Linda's jaw dropped. My father stared at me, his brow deeply furrowed in confusion. Ethan froze completely, his fork halfway to his mouth, the color draining from his face. My mother was the first to recover, her confusion quickly hardening into indignation. She saw my statement not as a revelation, but as a malicious, jealous lie designed to ruin her perfect evening. "What on earth are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice sharp. "Don't you dare try to cause a scene at our anniversary dinner. It's pathetic." I just stood there, meeting her gaze, waiting. She shook her head in disgust and delivered the final, fatal blow. "What money?" she asked, her laugh sharp and humorless. "Don't be ridiculous, Leo. We've never seen a dime from you." Her words hit me harder than a physical strike. In that instant, I understood. She wasn't just lying to cover for Ethan. She genuinely believed it. She had been so thoroughly blinded by the myth of her golden child that she couldn't see the truth. My brother hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my role as a son. He had taken my quiet, dutiful sacrifice and worn it like a costume, performing the part of the devoted provider while I was the one actually paying for the stage. A wave of ice-cold clarity washed over me. The hurt was gone, replaced by a grim resolve. I looked from my mother's angry, uncomprehending face to my brother's terrified, guilty one. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cold, hard rectangle of my phone. The performance was over. It was time to show them the receipts. My mother's accusation hung in the dead air of the dining room, a testament to a lifetime of willful blindness. "We've never seen a dime from you, Leo." For a moment, nobody moved. The relatives stared, caught between the drama and their half-eaten dinner. Ethan was a statue of pure panic, his eyes wide and pleading, silently begging me to let it go, to swallow this one last injustice for the sake of a quiet life. But I was done with quiet. I gave him a final, cold look before turning my back on the table. Without a word, I walked into the adjoining living room, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. My parents had a large flat-screen television mounted on the wall, a purchase Ethan had proudly taken credit for a year ago. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I held up my phone and tapped the screen mirroring function. A quiet chime echoed from the television as it connected, and suddenly, my phone's home screen was displayed 6 feet wide for everyone to see. The silence in the room deepened, becoming heavy and suffocating. It was broken only by the soft, deliberate taps of my thumb on the glass as I opened my banking app. I typed in my password, and the familiar blue and white interface of my account loaded on the screen, my current balance displayed in stark, bold numbers. I heard a few confused whispers from the table. This was so far outside the normal script of our family gatherings that no one knew how to react. My movements were slow, methodical. I navigated to the money transfer history. Then, I used the search function. I typed in a single name, ETHANMAXWELL. I hit enter, and for a fraction of a second, the screen was blank, as it processed the request. And then the list populated. It was a long, damning, unending scroll of my own sacrifice. The room was utterly silent as the first transaction appeared at the bottom of the screen, dated exactly 2 years ago. My voice cut through the quiet, not loud, but carrying with the clear, unshakable authority of fact. "This is the first payment," I said, pointing my phone at the screen like a remote control. "You can see the date and the recipient, my brother, Ethan." On the screen, in huge, undeniable letters, was the proof. Electronic funds transfer to Ethan Maxwell. Amount, $3,000. And then, right below it, was the detail that made my mother gasp. It was the memo I had included with every single transfer, a quiet message I thought only my family would understand. Memo, for Mom and Dad. And this, I continued, my thumb slowly scrolling up, is the next month. Another line appeared. Same name, same amount, same memo, and the month after that, and the month after that. I kept scrolling, a cascade of my own financial history filling the screen. 24 entries in total, a relentless, chronological record of my devotion. The murmuring at the table started to grow louder, shifting from confusion to shock. My Aunt Linda, who had been Ethan's biggest cheerleader, put a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. My father pushed his chair back from the table, his face pale. As a man who had worked his entire life, who understood the value of a dollar earned through sweat and exhaustion, the numbers on that screen were a language he understood perfectly. I watched my mother. Her initial, indignant anger had crumbled. She was leaning forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her eyes squinting at the screen as if the sheer force of her will could make the words disappear. I saw her lips move, silently reading the memo again and again. For Mom and Dad. For Mom and Dad. For Mom and Dad. The lie she had built her world around was being systematically dismantled, line by digital line. The golden child she had worshipped was being exposed as a fraud in high definition. I saw the exact moment her reality shattered. Her face crumpled, and a choked, guttural sob escaped her throat. Throughout the reveal, Clara had come to stand beside me. She didn't look triumphant or smug. Her expression was one of profound sadness. She gently placed a hand on the small of my back, a silent, steady anchor in the storm I had unleashed. My gaze finally shifted to my brother. He had shrunk in his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible. He was staring down at his plate, his face ashen, his hands trembling. The charismatic performer was gone, replaced by a cornered, terrified child. The designer shirt that had looked so impressive an hour ago now just looked like a costume on a failed actor. I scrolled to the top of the list, showing the most recent payment from just last week. 24 months, I said, my voice cutting through my mother's quiet sobs. $3,000 a month. That's $72,000 in total. I cut every corner in my own life to make sure that payment was never late. I did it because I was told you were in trouble. I did it because I thought I was helping. I finally lowered my phone, and the screen went black, plunging the room back into a thick, suffocating silence. The digital receipts were gone, but the truth was now hanging in the air, ugly and undeniable. I turned to face the table, my eyes locking onto my brother's. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 2 years of deceit. "So, Ethan," I asked, "why don't you tell them where it went?" The silence that followed my question was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air and energy out of the room, leaving only the raw, exposed truth. Every single person at that table was staring at Ethan, their expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. He was pinned in the spotlight, no longer the charismatic star, but a specimen under a microscope. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a fish gasping for air. He looked to my mother for help, for a comforting word or a defense, but she was staring blankly at the dark television screen, her mind clearly reeling as she tried to reconcile 2 years of lies. He found no sanctuary there. It was my father who finally broke the spell. His voice was low, raspy, and carried a dangerous weight I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Ethan," he said, not looking at him, but staring at the wall just past his head. "Your brother asked you a question. It wasn't a request. It was a command, a final, desperate order from a man watching the foundation of his life crumble." Ethan flinched as if he'd been struck. I was investing it," he stammered, his voice thin and cracking. "It was a pathetic first attempt, a lie so flimsy it was insulting. For them, I was trying to grow the money, make it work for them. But the market, it's been so volatile. I let out a short, humorless laugh. The market? I asked, my voice dripping with cold sarcasm. What market is that, Ethan? The luxury car market? The Swiss watch market? Tell me, what kind of returns are you getting on designer clothes these days? My direct hit seemed to shatter his composure. His face flushed a deep, blotchy red. No, it's not like that, he insisted, his voice rising in panic. I had to borrow some of it, just for a little while. I was going to pay it all back, I swear. It was for the business. You have to project an image of success. You have to spend money to make money. I did it for us, for this family. That was the line that finally broke my father. He slowly turned his head and looked at Ethan for the first time. The look in his eyes was not anger. It was a deep, hollow disappointment that was far more devastating. For the family? My dad whispered, his voice raspy with disbelief. He shook his head slowly. What did you do with the money, Ethan? Under the weight of my father's gaze, Ethan finally, completely, collapsed. He slumped forward in his chair, burying his face in his hands, and a racking, ugly sob tore through his body. The confession that followed was not a clean one. It was a messy, pathetic torrent of excuses and self-pity, punctuated by gasps for breath. He admitted everything. He confessed he'd only ever given my parents a few $100s a month, maybe $400 or $500, just enough pocket money, as he called it, to make them feel like he was contributing while keeping them in the dark. The rest, the other $2,500 a month, it was all gone. It had been the fuel for his grand illusion. It paid the lease on the BMW he drove to impress people who didn't matter. It paid for the watch on his wrist and the overpriced shirts on his back. It paid for the fancy dinners he'd passed off as client meetings and the weekend trips he'd framed as networking opportunities. It had all gone to service the massive credit card debt he'd racked up trying to be the person everyone thought he was. I was drowning, he sobbed, his words muffled by his hands. I was so in debt, I just wanted you to be proud of me. I didn't want you to think I was a failure. As he confessed, I watched my mother. Her face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated horror. Each word out of Ethan's mouth was another twist of the knife. She was realizing that every time she had praised his generosity, she had been celebrating a lie funded by the son she ignored. Every time she had held him up as an example, she had been an unwitting accomplice to his fraud. Her quiet sobs turned into a low, painful moan of regret. "Oh God," she whispered to no one in particular. "What have I done?" The relatives at the table were now openly whispering amongst themselves. $72,000, I heard my uncle mutter, and from his own brother. The admiration they once held for Ethan had curdled into open contempt. He had been socially and morally executed in front of everyone he'd ever wanted to impress. I stood there, watching the destruction, and felt a strange and unsettling mix of emotions. There was a grim, righteous satisfaction in seeing the truth finally brought to light. But as I looked at my brother, a sobbing, broken man-child, I felt a flicker of pity. He was a fraud, yes, but he was a fraud of my parents' own making. They had built the pedestal and demanded he stand on it, and he had simply crumbled under the weight. The 40th anniversary dinner was in ruins. The cake sat on the counter, untouched. My brother was crying uncontrollably. My mother was in a state of catatonic shock, staring into space. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes, his face a stony mask of grief. The perfect family portrait was shattered, and all that was left were the jagged, ugly pieces. The aftermath of Ethan's confession was a wasteland of shattered illusions. He continued to sob, a pathetic, gulping sound that filled the heavy silence. My mother sat motionless, her hands clasped on the table, looking at the ruins of the family she thought she had. My father stared at the wall, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable but radiating a profound sense of loss. The party was over. One by one, my aunts and uncles made their awkward excuses, murmuring quiet sympathies as they fled the emotional carnage, leaving the four of us alone in the wreckage. For a long time, nobody spoke. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable truth of what had happened. The power dynamic of our family, a structure that had been solidified for 30 years, had been pulverized in a matter of minutes. And in that vacuum, I finally found my voice. Clara, who had remained a steadfast, silent presence beside me, gave my hand a slight squeeze, and I stepped forward. "All right," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. It was calm, steady, and held an authority that no one in that room had ever heard from me before. "This is what happens now." 3 pairs of eyes lifted to look at me, my mother's, full of shame, my father's, weary and broken, and Ethan's, red-rimmed and pleading. "I am still willing to help," I stated, making it clear that this was a choice, not an obligation. "I will not let you lose this house. But my help is no longer unconditional. From this moment on, things are going to be different. There are new rules." I looked directly at my parents, letting my gaze rest on each of them. First, the comparisons stop, effective immediately. I am not a benchmark for Ethan's failures, and he is no longer the standard I am meant to achieve. I am Leo. I am your son. You will either respect me and my life for what they are, or you will not be a part of it. I am finished living in his shadow. My mother flinched as if I'd slapped her, but she nodded, a fresh wave of tears streaming down her face. "Second," I continued, my tone becoming even more businesslike, "we are going to have absolute financial transparency. Not one more cent of my money will ever pass through Ethan's hands. Tomorrow, Mom, you and I are going to the bank to open a new joint account. My name will be on it, and I will have full online access. I will deposit the money for the household expenses directly into that account. I will see every bill that is paid, every dollar that is spent. There will be no more secrets, no more pocket money, and no more lies." My dad, who had been silent until now, finally looked at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in his eyes that looked like respect. He gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. Finally, I turned my attention to my brother. He was still slumped in his chair, the picture of defeat. "Third," I said, my voice hard, you will contribute. The performance is over. You will get a real job, a 9 to 5, a paying by the hour, an actual verifiable job, and you will give a portion of every single paycheck to Mom and Dad. I don't care if it's $100. You will start taking on the responsibility you've been pretending to carry for 2 years. You will start acting like a son, not a parasite." I let my words hang in the air, a set of non-negotiable terms. I was no longer asking for their approval. I was telling them how it was going to be. "This is the deal," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "If you can all agree to live by these 3 rules, I will continue to support this family. If you can't, then I'm washing my hands of this. You can figure it out on your own. The choice is yours." For a moment, the only sound was Ethan's ragged breathing. Then, my mother, her voice choked and broken, whispered, "Yes, Leo. Okay. Whatever you say." Ethan, without lifting his head, gave a weak, shuddering nod. My declaration of independence was complete. I had not just exposed a lie, I had fundamentally re-engineered the entire structure of my family. The question now was whether this broken machine could ever run again. The year that followed was one of quiet, difficult reconstruction. There was no single, magical moment of forgiveness. The damage was too deep for that. Instead, healing came in small, incremental steps, like a forest slowly regrowing after a devastating fire. The day after the disastrous anniversary dinner, Clara and I sat with my mother at the kitchen table. Her eyes were puffy, and she looked exhausted, but for the first time, she met my gaze directly, without the filter of comparison or expectation. We went to the bank together, and just as I had stipulated, opened a new joint account. The process was formal and a little awkward, but it was the first brick in our new foundation. Every month I transferred the money, and every month my mom would meticulously pay the bills. Sometimes she'd text me a photo of a receipt for a major expense, like a plumbing repair or a prescription for my dad. It wasn't something I asked for, but I understood it for what it was. A small act of penance, her way of proving that the era of secrets was truly over. With the financial burden now transparent and controlled, the weight on my own life in Denver began to lift. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been my companion for 2 years finally receded. Clara and I were able to start planning for our own future again. We moved into a slightly larger apartment, started a real savings account for a down payment on a house, and 6 months after that fateful trip to Ohio, on a clear, crisp evening overlooking the city, I asked her to marry me. She said yes, her eyes sparkling, and in that moment I felt a sense of profound peace. My life was finally, truly my own. The phone calls home changed, too. They were stilted at first, as we all learned the new language of our family. But slowly, a new dynamic emerged. The conversations were no longer dominated by breathless updates of Ethan's fictional successes. Instead, my mother started asking about me. She'd ask about my projects at work, using the correct terminology she'd clearly made an effort to remember. She'd ask about Clara's work, about our wedding plans, about our life in Denver. She was trying, in her own clumsy way, to see the son who had been there all along. One evening, my father got on the phone, a rare occurrence. He told me he'd read an article about the rise of data analytics in the healthcare industry and started asking me questions about it. It was a short, slightly awkward conversation, but it was the first time in my life my dad had ever tried to enter my world. It meant more to me than he could ever know. As for Ethan, his fall from grace was brutal and public. He had to end the lease on the BMW at a catastrophic loss. He sold the designer watch for a fraction of what he'd paid. He had to face the quiet judgment of our relatives and the disappointed silence of our father. Hitting rock bottom, it turned out, was the best thing that could have ever happened to him. With no more lies to maintain, he was forced to confront the person he had become. A month after the anniversary, he got a job. He started selling cars at a dealership on the other side of town. It was a humbling position that nevertheless made use of his natural charm, but this time it was tethered to the real-world metrics of commissions and sales quotas. True to his word, he started to contribute. The first payment he sent home was for $400. My mom told me about it on the phone, her voice not filled with the blind pride of the past, but with a quiet, fragile hope. "He's trying, Leo," she said softly. "He really island." And he kept trying. Month after month, the contribution came, a small but consistent act of responsibility. He was slowly rebuilding his life, not as the family's celebrated star, but as a quiet, contributing member. The shadow he had cast over me for so long had finally receded, not because he had been banished, but because he had been forced to become a real person, standing on his own 2 feet. Our family was not perfect, and the scars of the betrayal would likely never fade completely. But we were finally operating on a new contract, one built not on performance and favoritism, but on honesty and a shared painful truth. Clara and I got married on a sun-drenched afternoon in a small botanic garden just outside of Denver. The Rocky Mountains, sharp and majestic, stood witness in the distance. It was exactly the wedding we wanted. Simple, elegant, and filled with a sense of authentic joy. There were no grand performances or flashy displays. Everything was real, from the vows we wrote ourselves to the laughter of our closest friends. My family flew in from Ohio, and their presence was a quiet testament to how much had changed. They were not the center of attention, they were simply guests, there to celebrate my life, in my city, on my terms. My mother, who once couldn't see past her own biased narrative, was a picture of gentle humility. Before the ceremony, she came to me, her eyes brimming with tears, and hugged me tightly. "I am so proud of the man you are, Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion I had waited my entire life to hear. "And Clara, she's a wonderful woman. You are so good for each other." There was no mention of Ethan, no comparison, just a simple, heartfelt acknowledgement of my happiness. My father, looking healthier and more at peace than he had in years, simply shook my hand, but his grip was firm and his eyes held a look of deep, quiet pride. Ethan was there too. He didn't stand beside me as a groomsman. Some wounds are too deep to heal that quickly, but he was there. He wore a simple suit, not a flashy designer one, and he looked more like himself than he had in years. He approached me before I walked out, his expression a mixture of nervousness and sincerity. "Congratulations, man," he said, meeting my eyes. "You really deserve this." In those few words, I heard an admission of everything that had happened between us. It wasn't a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement of my worth, and for now it was enough. As I stood at the altar, watching Clara walk toward me, a vision in white against the backdrop of the mountains, my entire life seemed to click into focus. I looked out at the small crowd, at my new wife, my supportive friends, and my broken, healing family, and I finally understood the truth. My value had never been up for debate. It wasn't something my parents could grant or withhold like an allowance. It was a fact I had to learn to recognize in myself. For years, I had been fighting for their validation, believing that their love was a prize to be won. But true strength isn't about winning a rigged competition. It's about having the courage to walk away from the game and build your own foundation, one based on integrity, honesty, and self-respect. Looking at Clara, I knew I had found a partner who saw me for exactly who I was. And looking at my family, I saw people who were finally learning to do the same. The road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but it would be real. Our new contract was holding. Our lives, once tangled in a web of lies and favoritism, were now finding a balance. I no longer lived in anyone's shadow. I was standing in the sunlight, next to the woman I loved, finally and completely at peace.